Okay, today we're going to start looking at chapter 10 and covering unit 1. So this is the last chapter that we're going to deal with. Chapter 10 in your textbook, I'm cutting some a little bit just so you know. The parts about the Eastern Europe and Byzantines, if you're following along with the text, they aren't very relevant for what we're hitting in world history at this point, so in a modern world sense. So chapter 10 kind of focuses on the worlds of quote-unquote Christendom, but realistically, it's mostly about Europe. We will talk a little bit about Christianity's impact on Africa towards the very end as well, but the majority of this is going to be how Europe is impacted by Christianity, what Europe's social structure is during it looks like during this time frame. So let's get right to it. Okay, the first piece. So how do we rebuild Europe after Rome? So the biggest thing you want to keep in mind here is that you've heard of the Roman Empire before. It's not covered in content-wise in this course due to our date range, but the Romans were a very strong military organization, an empire that existed up until 476. So the question is, after basically about 500 CE and for the next 500 years, what does Europe look like? And that's what we're going to be checking out. So with the fall of Rome, you've got a loss of central authority. So looking at this map, you kind of see an example of empires that come about after Rome in kingdoms, and I'll show you a little bit about that, particularly with Charlemagne, point number 3. But when you didn't have Rome there, there is a lack of central political military authority in Europe because Rome had more or less dominated the Mediterranean region up into 500 CE after it falls in 476. So what is the legacy of Rome in that sense? Well, Roman laws still continue, and a lot of Western European law codes will be based off Roman laws. They impact our own government in America today. So a lot of Roman laws, military organization structures, like how they fought, maintained. So a lot of people still harken back also just to the legacy of Rome in general as a way to show their legitimacy and their power because they're like Rome of old. One particular example we could give you would be the Frankish king Charlemagne, also sometimes said Charlemagne, whatever, you say it how you like. Charlemagne in around the 768 time frame is actually going to be taking control over Western Europe, mostly what you call modern day France and a lot of about half of Germany modern day. And so what happens here is that in the year 800, Charlemagne is crowned the emperor, the Holy Roman Emperor, by the Pope in 800 CE on Christmas Day. And so why is that significant? Well, the Pope is the head of the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church is pretty much the version of Christianity in Western Europe at this time. The Roman Catholic Church is very powerful. It has a lot of wealth, and it has a lot of prestige because it's still associated with that Roman legacy. And so when Charlemagne is crowned Holy Roman Emperor in the year 800 by the Pope, it establishes him as being a legitimate leader in this post-Roman world. Now, one of the reasons why Charlemagne is able to be crowned Holy Roman Emperor is because of what his grandfather did, Charles the Hammer Martel. That's Charlemagne's grandfather. So the Hammer, Mr. Martel, actually defeats a Muslim army, pictured here, the Battle of Tours in 732, about 30 years or so before Charlemagne's reign. And by defeating an invading Muslim army, what Charlemagne's grandfather did was basically block Muslim expansion into Europe. And that's why Europe only had a Muslim influence in Spain. If you didn't have this victory there, Europe may have had a lot more Muslim influence in France and Italy and Germany. So that's one of those turning point battles, kind of interesting. But Charles's grandfather wins. Charles Martel wins. Charlemagne is the recipient of the benefits of his grandfather's victory, and he's able to make this empire. Now, Charlemagne rules for this 40, 50-year time frame, but after he dies, his empire is split up and basically starts to crumble apart. So also one of his sons was named Charles the Bald, which I love these names of history. So with Charlemagne's empire crumbling, the question is yet again, like, who kind of fills this power void? Within about 100 years or so, you're going to have a Germanic-based empire, Otto the First of Saxony. He's a lord/king that takes over a lot of that modern-day Germany area. And he becomes crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope. So what you're starting to see is this pattern, is that if the Pope blesses you, crowns you this Holy Roman Emperor, you're kind of seen as the authority in the region, and it gives you more legitimacy because you want to be allied with the church. It's important to be allied with the church because while you may be powerful as a king on earth, church is the line to God, who is all powerful in the Christian world, right? So the Holy Roman Empire under Otto will exist on and off for the next couple hundred years. I'm not going to go really in depth into European history at this point, but for those of you that are super interested, feel free to check that one out. Just kind of want to give you a little basics of what's happening in that first couple hundred years after the fall of Rome. Next thing we need to look at is how society and the church are influenced. We'll look at political structures and how the church is influenced by their non-Christian neighbors. So first, let's talk about how society is set up in Europe at this time, and that's under the concept of feudalism. Feudalism is a very complex social and political system of how people are loyal to those higher up in class and status. Feudalism oftentimes will be showcased with this pyramid. You get used to seeing that if you're ever thinking feudalism. And the whole basics of the system is you're loyal to someone else higher up on the totem pole for protection and for land, basically. So a king would have a large, a swath of land that they would then distribute out to various nobles or vassals. Okay, and then those nobles would have knights or lesser lords that would swear loyalty to them, and then the nobles would then divvy up their land to those lesser lords. And then on the lesser lords, they might even give it to some knights, or knights might live with those lesser lords, whatever. And then eventually, at the bottom of the totem pole are the peasants or the serfs, and they work the fields. They do the grunt work for on this land, essentially. They're not slaves. They have some freedoms, like to technically do what you want, but realistically, there's not a lot of opportunity. Just because you have your freedom doesn't mean there's a lot of opportunity to express it. Like going and living where you want or doing what you want, that's not what's happening for a lot of these serfs. So this process is where you give out these lands, you give these fiefs for loyalty, okay? And what really starts to result of this is what's called the manorial system, where a lord might have the manor, his like large house, or sometimes even a castle, and that's kind of the center of the small village. And outside of the lord's manor, his castle or large house are a church, a blacksmith, a merchant shop or two, and then a bunch of like little small houses for these like serfs and other people to live in. And then surrounding these surrounding these houses would be the fields where they farm their food. And so this becomes the manor system, and this becomes a self-sufficient community where you can get everything you need in this community. Some of these serfs live their entire lives without ever leaving this 10 square mile radius, so to speak. So it's kind of interesting. And so it's all about protection because the serfs in time of need, if they're about to be invaded by some kind of force, they could go into the lord's manor, castle, and everyone would hole up together there for protection as necessary. Now, the Roman Catholic Church still has the heaviest influence on society at this point and on the king and those higher up in society. The Roman Catholic Church is able oftentimes to avoid taxes and able to get tithes from their population. And so they are associated with a lot of wealth and influence. And they hearken back yet again to this legacy of Rome, this prestige as a result. And so what you start to see is that Roman Catholicism initially is kind of targeting the elites, but then it starts to spread out into the majority of the population. So sometimes we see religions only stay with the elites in a society. Roman Catholicism, Christianity here spreads to a large percentage of the population of Europe at this time. And so what starts to happen is that Christianity starts to adjust and conform, and you see some of these blends of non-Christian practices. So when I say number 3, RC, I'm talking about Roman Catholicism here. And so pagans are basically considered non-Christians. and most religions have a word for whoever they consider like a non-version of their religion, like it might be infidel in Islam or something like that, right? So pagans are what they call them here. And so what Christianity, early popes and as a religion is evolving in some ways, because you're now, hundreds of years past Jesus's life itself, they start to integrate a little bit of some of the practices of what you see in the non-Christian groups. So they might incorporate some holidays, or if there's evil spirits in the forest, those spirits are not just random spirits of whatever. They might be actually demons, and you might then use a saint's sign or a medallion with with Mary or something like that to kind of signify protection against that. One of the big debates in history was, what was the actual date of Jesus's birth? We've kind of settled on December 25th, and a lot of people say that's because that was the winter solstice, which some non-Christians had practiced at that point, these quote-unquote pagans. So they're incorporating some of these aspects, and it really, in the long run, though, helps to make a lot of people convert to the faith that had traditionally not been Christian. But so the question grows as Christianity is growing in power as well of, who's more powerful, the king or the priest on earth? Well, the priest is, and the Pope, big picture, is, has these direct connections to God and is supposed to, be God's, messenger, so to speak, on earth. So they may not necessarily have as much earthly power, but, the king might have more earthly power, but, the afterlife, that's, God is all powerful, right? So the conflict between church and state starts to evolve. And at one point, there's even a huge controversy called the investiture controversy, which is basically who's going to appoint priests, bishops, church officials. Is that going to be the king or is that going to be the Pope? The Pope's going to win out in this time frame. So you're going to basically see that separation of church and state in the long run. When I say that, I basically mean that the church has the autonomy to select its church officials. The king doesn't get to do that because the king might choose a priest that's going to be more loyal to him, right? So that's a playoff here between who's got more power on earth, so to speak. All right, moving on. So now you start to see some changes come about. So that 500 to 1,000 period time range, that's what we were just talking about. Now after 1000 CE, we start to see some changes happening. One, there's less outside invasion threats. So one of the reasons why we had this feudalism mindset that people needed protection is because there were a lot of groups that were running around and just pillaging and plundering because there's no central authority. So the best example I can give you would be the Vikings. The Vikings would come from Scandinavia. They were seaborne, so they hop on their ships and they plunder all around the North Sea here. So if you were on the coast or near coastal areas, Vikings might be showing up at some point, raid, pillaging, and plundering your town. And so that's why they needed these lords and these large castles, estates, these manors for protection. The Magyars are another group. They're more of a nomadic Eastern European group, some Germanic influence, but they're just another invasion, threat of invasion force. But a lot of those forces start to die down, to weaken. And so after about 1000 CE, that need for as much protection is kind of going away. So that leads us to what's called the High Middle Ages. All right, the High Middle Ages in that 1000 to 1300 time frame. And what you're going to see here is the revival of trade. So you're going to see more long-distance trade as a result of this. A lot of more involved in Mediterranean again. Population and economic growth, because they're more trade means more economic growth. They're going to farm better, which means you have more food, so you can have more babies. And then it's going to warm up. I mean, just realistically, it's going to be warmer, so it's easier to grow crops. There was what they call the Little Ice Age right before this. And so because it was colder, it's harder to stay alive, literally. And so because it warms up, it makes life easier. This is like the mini version of global warming, even though it doesn't really have anything to do with global warming, besides just Earth cycles, warming and cooling. You're also going to see the growth of monarchies in this time frame. So Christian kings in England and in France are going to grow in power, and people start to ally themselves more of being English and French rather than just of a local lord or tribe. So these monarchies grow in power. Your towns start to urbanize more into these medieval towns. So it's not just these kingdoms that are set aside and everyone's now just focused on that manor. Now you're going to see more towns that may not be centered in one specific area or tied to one manor, one lord. And people start to specialize their labor as a result. They'll have the establishment of guilds. These are like early trade unions. And guilds essentially will be a group of people working together to share common quality control concerns, prices. Basically, it might be a bunch of blacksmiths together that have a blacksmith's guild, and they say, we've certified this person does good work. It should always cost about this. And then the guilds are also how people would, enter the workforce. So you might have an apprentice to a blacksmith who's making swords or tools, and then they do that for so many years, and then they are qualified as a blacksmith in the future. So that labor specialization helps urbanize these towns and for them to grow instead of people being so spread out in rural centers. Or not rural centers, but just rurally everywhere. So you're also going to see the change of women's roles in society. So initially, early on, when there's less political authority, there's more opportunities in the work and in the church. We talked about women being, nuns in the Christian world. And this is kind of a common theme, if you see this. When there's less central political authority, women usually have more freedom because there's less like rules, laws, and things put in place. And men kind of need women to be more aggressive or dominant. Those aren't really the words I'm trying to say, but more impactful in society. Then once you start to have like things settle down from like a safety standpoint, more political security control, then you typically see that kind of patriarchy restored, which is what we see here in Europe at this time in both the church and in the daily lives as well. All right, finally, let's talk about the Crusades. So what you're going to see spring out this time frame is the idea of the Holy Land. So the Holy Land is what you would know of as like modern day Israel, think Middle East here, right? And so it's the Holy Land because it's holy to several different groups of people, Jews, Christians, and Muslims, right? So they all consider some of these areas holy to them, particularly the city of Jerusalem, right? And so what starts to happen is that in the thousands, by about 1095, you're going to see a call issued out for the Crusades to basically retake the Holy Land. And so this Holy Land is something that is currently owned by the Muslims, and the Pope issues out a call. Hey, if you're a good Christian, you need to come with us, and we need to take back the Holy Land, because right now the Muslims have control of it. And so that's what happens. You have kings, knights, sinners, all sorts of different walks of life come, and they partake in these crusades to retake the Holy Land. They might be able to win their forgiveness for sins or things like that. And that's one of the reasons why people do it. So the first crusade itself happens in 1095. And outside of all these crusades, it's arguably the most successful one. In 1095, the first crusade actually captures the city of Jerusalem. They hold it for a time frame. It's eventually reconquered by Muslim forces, but they did achieve success there. Over time, there's going to be a lot of different crusades. I've heard as many as easy 7. We'll talk about really 2. There's also one like really one that it's called the Children's Crusade that went way astray. Basically, a bunch of kids were supposed to go to the Holy Land. A lot of them got captured along the way. It was a hot mess. So First Crusade was successful. They captured Jerusalem, the whole Holy Land. The Fourth Crusade, a terrible outcome in the long run. A lot of Christian groups get together in Western Europe. Instead of going to the Holy Land and fighting for the faith against Muslims, instead they attack like Italy. They attack a city or two in Italy, and they eventually attack Constantinople. Constantinople, which was the capital city of the Byzantine Empire at that time, which was a Christian empire. They weren't Roman Catholic, but we'll get there. And so as a result, this crusade, they end up attacking fellow Christians, essentially, and never even really making it to the Holy Land. So that was a failure. That's not really a crusade. So regardless, in the long run, for about the next 200 years, there'll be smaller Christian kingdoms that are in the Holy Land area, that they'll hold on to. They may not be very large or strong, but you'll see that pervade for the next couple hundred years. What's the big picture crusades? Why do we talk about them? They promote cross-cultural trade, more interactions between Jews, Christians, and Muslims, technology and information transfer. So the Crusades do, while they may not necessarily have long-lasting impacts in the Islamic world, they do impact the Christian world arguably more at this time. All right, that's part one, what we wanted to talk about. We'll continue on with part two, and basically what Europe looks like technologically speaking in the next couple slides. Thanks for watching.